Owen Lingley and Jess Caudill from Imperial Yeast join me to talk about yeast starters. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 161. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 161, and it's early December 2017. This week, Owen Lingley and Jess Caudill from Imperial Yeast join me. Thank you to this week's sponsors, Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. They have a great online learning platform, which you can find at learn.beerandbrewing.com, where you can take a wide variety of our online courses in brewing. They also have an offer code, BeerSmith 2017, which gives you 20% off when you sign up for any of their online courses. Learn more about brewing at learn.beerandbrewing.com. And also the new BrewVision thermometer from Blickman Engineering. This interactive wireless digital thermometer connects right to your iPhone or iPad and lets you remotely monitor and record temperatures. You can download your recipes right from the BeerSmith cloud and send updates and alerts as you brew. Get the BrewVision Bluetooth thermometer today. Another great innovation from BlickmanEngineering.com. Again, that's BlickmanEngineering.com. And also BeerSmith software, the industry standard for home and professional brewers. It lets you design great beer recipes and brew with confidence. Download your free 21-day trial from BeerSmith.com today. And now let's jump into this week's episode. Today on the show, I welcome Owen Lingley and Jess Caudill. Owen is co-owner at Imperial Yeast. He also worked at Y Yeast and started craft canning and bottling, which he still runs, before he started Imperial Yeast about 2.5 years ago. Jess is head of the technical service department and has been in the beer industry for 22 years, including Y Yeast and Everybody's Brewing, where he was head of production. It's great to have you guys on the show. It's Owen. How are you, man?
I'm great. How are you, Brad?
I'm doing good. You guys, where are you located? I'm trying to remember now.
Portland, Oregon, about 5 miles east of the airport.
Oh, nice. Pretty out there, I bet.
It's gray today, but I don't want to live anywhere else.
It's gray there a lot, isn't it? Or am I wrong?
Yeah, every day. Nobody should.
Every day. And Jess, it's great to have you on the show as well, man.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
So you do technical service. You must have a lot of fun with that, right?
Yeah, it allows me to talk to a ton of people about making beer every day. So it's tons of fun.
That's awesome. Well, Owen, today we're going to talk a little bit about yeast starters and pitch rates and maybe dive into the numbers a little bit. First, I wanted to talk about yeast quality and why yeast quality is so critically important for making great beer.
You can't really make great beer without good yeast quality, or tons of off flavors come from unhealthy yeast. If you're running a business and trying to do things commercially, you need to plan things out. You need consistent tank residency time, consistent flavor profile, so the beer from Gen 1 to Gen 2 to Gen whatever tastes similar, and you're not sending out an IPA that tastes different every week. You don't really want a ton of diacetyl. You don't want a bunch of other sulfur off flavors that can come from poor yeast health, so it's critically important.
And are you guys, I don't even know the answer to this, are you guys doing commercial yeast production as well? I know you do home brewing, obviously, homebrew size packages.
Yeah, we're about 90% commercial.
Oh, really? That's great. That's fantastic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're working with between 600 and 700 breweries right now.
So Jess, we let's start with how much yeast you need for a typical homebrew batch. I think we're usually talking something in the billions, right?
Yeah, for 5-gallon batches, you're in the billions. So anywhere from, let's say, 150 billion to 300 billion, depending on what kind of beers you're making.
And is that something that's pretty easy to calculate?
Yeah, there's a lot of online calculators now that make it pretty easy to plug in your original gravity numbers and what kind of beer you're making, if it's a lager or ale, and it'll crank out how many cells you need.
And I think you need quite a few more if you're making a lager, right?
Yeah, typically people are pitching about twice as many cells per mil or per liter or whatever you want to call it for lagers.
And how do you go about? Is there a rule of thumb that you use, I guess?
Yeah, the rule of thumb I use, and I think is somewhat well accepted on average is about 0.75 million cells per mil per degree Plato for ales. And then for lagers, people are using on average around 1.5 million cells per mil per degree Plato.
So if I do the math right, let's see, something like a 1044, I wrote this down, 1044 ale starting at, say, 5 gallons or 19 liters for the folks overseas, ends up being about 156 billion cells. I'm sorry, 156 billion cells, I believe that's correct.
Yep.
How big is a typical homebrew pack? A lot of them aren't quite that big, though, are they?
Yeah, I'd say most of the packs on the market are at 100 billion cells total or under that. Ours are up at 200 billion total.
So that means in most cases, if you're working with liquid yeast, you're going to need some kind of starter, right?
Yeah, for most of the liquid yeast available in the past, you would need to make a starter to hit the pitch rates that you're looking for.
And Owen, of course, we're looking at viable cells, right? And cells don't live forever, right?
They do not.
So how long, how do you actually go about estimating the viability of, say, liquid yeast or dry yeast or that anything like that?
There's a ton of different methodologies to do that. We guarantee our product for 3 months. We're confident that at 3 months we have enough yeast inside the package, even on our least, the strain that holds up worst over time, that it's going to be able to ferment your beer out and do just fine. Some other suppliers have a 6-month lead time. Viability over time is really cell or strain dependent. And then there's so many different variables that go into it. Was it ever shipped? Did it ever get warm? Is the fridge that it's stored in, 45 degrees or 35 degrees? Lots of different variables like that can have significant impacts on viability over time.
And you guys use a pretty unique packaging method too, not like in fact, I think all the major producers, at least here in the U.S., use different packaging methods now, right?
I guess a nice way to say it is we're not going to be unique for too much longer.
Okay.
We've been working on new packaging for several months here.
But I think your current product comes in a can, is that right?
It currently does come in a can. That's what we started with. We've been running that for 2 years. We want to, we're going to be switching over to a stand-up pouch when we finish some long-term trials here in a few months. I think some people know about it, but not too many so far.
But the key, of course, with liquid yeast is to refrigerate it, right?
Liquid yeast does need to be refrigerated. Yes, we produce live cultures. We're a perishable food producer. Liquid yeast does need to be refrigerated.
And then dry yeast. First of all, how's dry yeast different than liquid yeast?
It's made on a much larger scale. The technical challenges of keeping it, of growing it, are very different than what we do. Mm-hmm. It has better viability over time. There's not as many strains that can be dried or handle the drying process. So you can get much more variety with liquid yeast than you can with dry yeast, mm-hmm. as well as dry yeast is, you don't know your cell count. I don't know a dry yeast supplier that puts their cell count on their package. That we're really big believers in knowing what you put into your beer. Understanding the amount of grain that you put in, understanding the amount of hops that you put in, understanding the amount of yeast that you put in. If you want a consistent product, you need to put consistent amounts of ingredients in.
But it does give you a much longer shelf life. It only loses, I think it's only a couple % a month or something like that on a typical storage.
For dried yeast?
Yeah, for dry yeast.
Honestly, I don't know if there's been long-term studies done. I've never seen any anything. It does last longer than liquid yeast. It should be refrigerated, and I think a lot of the same factors that in terms of yeast health, I use dry yeast for baking. I keep my dried yeast in the fridge. It should be refrigerated, is my understanding of it. But I don't know of any long-term studies that that have a definite answer on by strain of dried yeast and how they last over time. Do you, Jess?
Jess, your thoughts?
I haven't seen any data on it, but I mean, in general, dried yeast is going to last longer. That's why they've made dried yeast for bread making, so it can be stabilized and shipped all over the place, warm and used.
And they use it in a lot of kits too for the same reason, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Got better shelf life.
Yeah, just more, I guess it's just not as susceptible to a viability problems with temperature increases.
And Jess, your thoughts on viability and storage of the yeast and so on? What can you do to maximize the life of your yeast?
Yeah, I mean, the big thing is to keep the yeast cold and store it for as short amount of time as possible. Those are the big two things. Time and temperature are huge for yeast health.
Packaging also drives the actual storage or how it lasts. Can you tell us, Owen? You mentioned you're changing your packaging now. How does some of the different packaging options actually drive how the yeast survives and produces or survives and helps us brew better beer?
I don't think the actual vessel that the yeast is stored in matters, whether it's stainless, plastic, aluminum. Most food packaging is going to use the same internal. Most food packaging is going to use the same internal liner, what the yeast is going to touch anyways, whether it's in a stand-up pouch or a container or a can or anything else. The big thing is keeping it cold and using it fresh is the big thing that we tell people. And
Owen, so we get our cell count or whatever. How do we actually go about developing the proper cell count? Knowing that a package is probably going to be smaller than what we need, how do we go about creating the number of cells we need to brew beer?
Well, if you use our product, we don't believe that it's smaller than you need. We set the lab up to provide the correct amount of pitch rates for most beers. Actually, on our new packaging, we have pitch rate numbers for the package. So one of our packages we're keeping the same 200 billion cell count. One package into 5 gallons or 19 liters is going to give you a pitch rate of 10.5 million cells per mil. So if you're doing a 10 Plato beer, it's 1 million cells per mil per degree Plato. If you're doing a 14 Plato beer, it's 0.75 million cells per mil Plato. So 10 divided by 14 equals 0.75 million cells per mil per degree Plato. If you're doing 16 Plato beer, it's 0.66 million cells per mil per degree Plato.
That'd be a pretty big beer, though, right?
Yeah, people brew a lot of varieties of beer. We're big fans of understanding what you're putting in and trying to stay around that 0.75 million cells per mil per degree Plato rule that Jess mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
Our 200 billion, I think Jason and I, Jason worked up at Y Yeast with Jess and I, and he's my partner here. We averaged out the BJCP style guidelines and then weighted IPAs a little heavier, and the standard beer was 1053 or something like that. And to do the math at 0.75 million cells per mil per degree Plato equals the amount of yeast that we provide to people both on a home brew and commercial scale.
So you guys decided to produce, if I understand it right, you're packaging roughly twice as much yeast as many of your competitors, right?
We're packaging twice as much yeast as Y Yeast and on average about 3 times as much as White Labs.
So that's 200 billion cells versus I think most of those are roughly 100 billion cells. I can't remember the exact counts, but the large packages, the large Y Yeast are about 100 billion, aren't they?
Y Yeast is 100 billion cells.
And I'm pretty sure the new Pure Patch packets are about the same size, roughly. I think the new ones are, anyways.
I have not seen them hit 100 billion cells in our internal testing.
Okay. Jess, how do you? Let's talk about starters for a minute. You're saying you may not need a starter for your particular beer, depending on the style, but starters are still needed for a lot of beers. Can you tell us what size a typical homebrew starter might be?
Yeah, I think, a good size to work with is about 2 liters if you're running around 5-gallon batches, if you need to make a starter. If you're using our product with a starter, 2 liters would be the minimum I'd recommend, just based on the amount of yeast that you're putting into that small starter. It needs to be at least 2 liters to get good growth and a significant increase in new cells.
Right, because if you're pitching too many cells into a starter, you're actually not really going to grow that much, right?
Exactly. You'll just end up with still older population of yeast. Your population of new cells will be a small percentage of the whole population.
So it's kind of like putting 50 sheep on an acre of land or something like that, right? They just don't.
Exactly. Yeah.
They aren't gonna eat that much grass before it's all gone, right?
Exactly. They won't make too many new sheep too quickly.
We could also consider 2-stage starters, right? If you're starting with a very small yeast population, you can step up twice, right?
Yeah, definitely. If you're,
making a 10-gallon batch or a 20-gallon batch,
exactly.
For example.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a good way to potentially, if you want to remove some of that starter volume from what you're pitching into your batch, then multi-stage props would allow you to grow the yeast up a little bit, and then you could decant or get rid of the propagation liquid and add more starter to that yeast and allow it to grow, and in essence not add a high percentage of starter wort to your big imperial stout or barley wine.
And Owen, how do you go about preparing a starter at home? We talked about having a 2-liter starter or something like that. Is there a certain gravity you shoot for in the starter? How do you actually do this at home?
We run all of our propagations internally at 1040. You don't get a lot more growth with a high gravity starter. We don't recommend doing that. We recommend running all your starters for both ales and lagers at 72 degrees.
So you're saying even if you're doing a lager starter, it's perfectly appropriate to do the starter at room temperature then?
Yes, sir.
Awesome. And you said 1040 is roughly the original gravity you would use for a typical starter?
That is correct. Some people will do high gravity starters. That's just going to stress the yeast out. We really want to keep alcohol low throughout the propagation process. We do a couple things internally that no other lab does to decrease alcohol and increase pH as soon as we can in the process. Doing a high gravity starter, putting a little yeast into a lot of sugar is just going to have that yeast sit for a long time in an alcoholic solution, and that's going to decrease viability.
Interesting. So I assume when you're making yeast commercially, you're probably doing it at a fairly low gravity, right?
No, we run everything at 1040.
So there you go. So even your production's being done at, say, 1040, roughly?
Yep.
So walk us through the starter process, Owen. Are you, how would you prepare a typical starter at home? On the stovetop, for example.
Sure, I don't. I'm spoiled. I own a yeast lab, so I can just grab a couple cans.
Well, yeah, you've got infinite amounts.
But if you're doing a 10-gallon batch and you want to do a starter, I would grab an Erlenmeyer, heat up your liquid, sterilize it, bring it back down, pitch at about the same 72 degrees, put it on a stir plate. I would understand get a good guesstimate on when that yeast is going to finish out, so you're not leaving the yeast on a stir plate after it's run out of sugar. That's a pretty easy way to hurt your starter. And then when you finish, I would put it in the fridge to chill it down. If you want to decant or try to time your starter to hit terminal gravity close to pitching time on your brew day.
And Jess, how much growth can you expect from some of these things? You're not going to get infinite growth. We talked about that earlier, but how much growth can you get from generation to generation, even if you do a single large starter?
Yeah, if you use, let's say, 200 billion cells in 2 liters, you'll roughly double that amount of yeast. If you want to go up higher, you would need to use just a larger volume. So if you're going up to around 6 liters, you're going to be around the, let's say, 500 billion, 600 billion total cells.
So, I mean, you're typically getting maybe 2 to 3x growth, maybe, or something like that from a typical starter?
I think that's where most people are hitting. You can probably go a little higher when you're using some agitation, like a stir plate. You can get a little bit higher growth quicker.
Yeah, and Owen, you mentioned the stir plate earlier. What does the stir plate actually do for you?
It's going to keep your yeast in suspension and then keep oxygen in the solution. If you're not using oxygen, yeast are really efficient at picking it up. It's going to make your starter wort oxygen deficient really fast. Stir plate's just going to keep shaking it and bringing oxygen into solution, which is going to make the yeast grow aerobically. So, 1, they're in contact with sugar, and 2, they have more oxygen. So that's why you get better growth numbers with that.
So a stir plate's going to give you more cells when you're done, right? How much more do you know, roughly?
I would say it's around 25 to 50% more cells, depending on how you're doing it. If you're actually adding some air to your propagation, you can get higher counts. Mostly with the stir plate, you're knocking out CO2, and it just helps the yeast grow faster. So when you're pitching that yeast, you're at a higher cell count than you would be without agitation.
So interesting. So in addition to, we talked about the oxygenation, which I want to hit that for a minute. Owen, do you think you should aerate a starter? Is that appropriate or not?
Yeah.
With oxygen? You do recommend that?
Yep.
Yeah.
Jess?
So, I could take,
Yeah.
like I got one of these little oxygen wands. I could take that and pop it in my starter and get hopefully a stronger start then. Owen?
Yes.
Yeah. So that would work, huh? Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And then we talked about the stir plate as well, helps push CO2 out. And this is something I've been playing with, making wines and meads is, you actually go through a process when you make mead, for example, where you, beat, you use a kind of a wine, they call it a wine whip. You use a wine whip and you actually beat, the CO2 out of the thing while it's fermenting, and it helps it continue to progress to ferment, because we're talking about really, really high gravity meads, for example. Jess, is that the same effect we're seeing with the stir plate, for example, by pushing the CO2 out?
Yeah, it's a similar thing. You're just decreasing the stress on the yeast by removing the CO2 from the system. And at the lab here, when we're continuously aerating our propagations, it's also removing the CO2. If you aren't adding air or agitating, the propagation moves way slower. So we're just removing.
So you aerate consistently? How long throughout the entire process, or how does that work?
We aerate constantly.
You do,
but we're also not trying to make beer. We're making yeast. One of the problems with constant aeration is it leads to higher acid production in the yeast, and your end result, beer, doesn't taste that great. So back to the idea of adding oxygen or air to your starter is good at the beginning, but if you're going to add that complete starter volume to your wort, you don't want to do continuous aeration or oxygenation. Continuous oxygenation would be damaging to the yeast.
Okay. And then Owen, let's talk about, if you pitch the yeast, you're going to want to aerate it again, right? For yeast health, correct?
Yes.
And do you recommend, I've seen some recommendations online where people recommend possibly aerating twice for very high gravity beers. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's smart. You're coming back after your first division and pumping up your mother and daughter cell walls.
So somebody told me 1080. I think so like something over 1080, it might be appropriate to come back in 12 hours and aerate it again. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's going to depend on the beer that you're doing, but I think there's less of a risk of getting off flavors from oxygen than there is from having your fermentation stall out towards the end when it's in a really alcoholic solution with high grav beers.
So you're concerned about off flavors if you aerate too late. Obviously, you don't want to aerate much after the fermentation started, right?
Well, your fermentation should have started if you're pitching 12 or 24 hours later, your fermentation should be going. I think the risk of off flavors with small additions of oxygen during early stages of fermentation for high gravity beers is less than the risk of off flavors that are going to come from stressed out yeast towards the end of fermentation that are stalling.
So you're saying if you get a high gravity beer, perfectly appropriate. When would you? I mean, I said 12 hours, but when would you recommend the second dose of oxygen for a high gravity beer? Jess, your thoughts?
I would try to keep it within 12 to 18 hours. It depends on how quickly your fermentation's moving. But one thing to keep in mind too is that if your yeast is ripping, it's going to soak up that O2 really fast. It's also relevant to deliver that O2 in small bursts over a period of time instead of just cranking O2 through it for a few minutes and really saturating the fermenting wort. You could dose it in at smaller increments so the yeast takes it up quickly and you don't have a surplus of oxygen hanging out for a few minutes.
Well, Owen, where can you learn more about cell counts, viability, starters, those kinds of things?
I probably talk to 10 to 15 people a day that call in. We have a lot of people with just calling off the website or send in messages on both commercial and homebrew for, hey, we're doing this. We want this specific beer. What would you recommend for a pitch rate, or how would I answer this question? There's some really good books out there, reading, podcasts, talking to people. There's a lot of good info out there. Some of it's not true, I guess, on the internet. You shouldn't really believe everything you read, but
I thought everything was true. No? You're saying there's fake news even in beer, huh?
There is.
Yeah. Doesn't surprise me that much. Well, Jess, I wanted to talk for a minute about growing yeast commercially. I'm going to ask both of you, but maybe you could just talk a little bit about how you actually grow yeast commercially. I think a lot of people might be interested in learning how you produce yeast.
Sure. We basically obtain a culture of yeast, and the starting point for us is we have to bank that yeast so we can keep it stable over, I guess, years and years of growing yeast. So
what does that mean? What does banking the yeast mean?
Yeah, so banking, part of that is isolating a pure culture, and then we put that into a freezer vial and store it at -80 C, and that is what we call our mother culture. And from that, every few months we'll make some slants, which are a way to store the yeast in a state that we can quickly propagate from. So that's the first step, is preparing a freezer vial for storage and then a slant for production.
So I assume those have to be super pure, right?
Exactly. We ran quite a few tests on our yeast to make sure that we're working with a pure sample. So we're not propagating multiple strains or the wrong yeast.
Mm-hmm. And then, Owen, can you pick us up from there? Let's say we start with a slant, and now we want to actually produce, which is a very small amount of yeast. Now we want to actually produce something in the quantities that you use for commercial brewing. How do you actually do that?
Sure. We also we're a completely open lab. We have people drop in all the time, and we walk people through the entire process. I think we're the only open lab in the country that I know of. So if anybody's ever in Portland, just stop on by. We'll walk you through the whole thing in person. But from that working slant, we're gonna grow it up in the lab. So it's going to go into test tubes and mini flasks and bigger flasks, and those are grown in an incubated shaker table. Once we get it up to brewery volumes, it's going to go out into the production side of things. We grow in stainless steel conical vessels. It looks just more or less just like a brewery. We cook our media in a giant pressure cooker. So the hot side of our hot side, instead of a 3-vessel system for a brewery, we'll have a single vessel. We cook at 240 degrees and 20 psi to make sure that our media is sterile. We're going to brew high grav and then blend down with sterile water.
So what are you using for media? You're probably not mashing grains, right?
No, we don't. We're using Breeze organic DME, organic cane sugar. We're a certified organic lab as well. So we have to be very careful on no GMO products, no petrochemicals. All of our nutrients need to be mined instead of synthesized. And then our sugar can't be GMO. So we're using organic cane sugar and Breeze organic DME. We don't really want to brew. One, it's nice to know the exact volume without the boil off, and two, spent grain is a big potential infection hazard for us.
Right, because it has lactic acid, or I'm sorry, it has lactobacillus, all the other lovely bacteria we use to make sour beer, right?
That is correct. Yeah, so we don't actually mix. We try to minimize any crossover, even with DME. Like guys have to suit up for DME whenever they're cooking. They have to suit up, and then they take off that, throw away their gloves, throw away their hairnets, and switch into new production clothing for when they're transferring wort around. So the sugar source is a big infection hazard for us. Right.
And then, so are you brewing a fairly low, you said a low gravity beer, so something like 1040, right? When you're producing, right? And then other things you do different, you mentioned you aerate it all the time?
Yep. We're going to run filtered compressed air up through the bottom of each tank throughout fermentation. Like Jess said, it's going to drive out CO2. It's going to allow the yeast to grow faster. We'll batch feed over a couple days. We've set the lab up that everything is grown in the exact same container. So we have everything from half-barrel conicals up to 20-barrel conicals. And depending on the strain and the expected yield and what we think orders for 600 brewers and thousands of home brewers are going to be for the week, that's how we'll kind of balance what strain goes where in which tank and how much sugar it gets. Once we batch feed it and it hits terminal gravity, we turn off oxygen, turn on glycol, have it settle out of solution. From there, we'll do harvests. And then
so how do you concentrate the yeast, or how do you get the yeast into a concentrated form, I assume, because it's obviously not when you produce it, right?
It depends on the strain. We're going to turn on glycol. It's just like a brewery. The yeast will drop out of suspension when it gets colder. Drops down to the bottom of the tank. We blow off trube, harvest the yeast, and then we'll go back through and concentrate or dilute every strain to our lab density, which is 1.29 billion cells per mil. In part of that concentration process, we're going to pour off our supernatant, or the beer, and replace with sterile water. That's going to decrease alcohol and increase pH early on in the process, which we're finding does well for viability over time. Keeps the yeast healthy, and every strain is different in terms of solid by volume at that 1.29 billion cells per mil. So Some strains will be really thick and cottage cheese and 60% solid by volume. Some strains will be really watery and 15% solid by volume, but it's all 1.29 billion cells per mil. And once we have that, we can go off, and it makes our production process or the packaging process for either homebrew or commercial easier once everything's at the same volume.
And Jess, do you have anything you want to add on commercial yeast production? I know you're familiar with it as well.
I mean, those are the main points. Something I'd like to hit on is, unlike breweries, we're processing our wort differently. And Owen had mentioned that we heat our wort up to really high temperatures under pressure to make sure we're nuking everything in it. And we're testing our sterile media. We blend it down with sterile water, which we're testing every day. And then we're also running sterilized air through our tanks. So on top of testing a finished product, we're running tests on all of the inputs on the system. So I wouldn't say it's a big difference from breweries, but it's, I guess, a different level of checks that we have to run to make sure everything's dialed.
So quality control must be really important for you, Owen, especially I mentioned we've got on your website there that you're a certified organic, right?
We are certified organic. We think if you can be green, you should. It took about a year of bench trials to figure out how to get it to grow organically, and when we're happy with it. QC is huge for us. Organic is nice. Probably 10% of our commercial customers and maybe that much of our homebrew customers are really excited that we're able to complete the organic circle with organic malt and organic hops. Now they have an option for organic yeast. Most of our other customers don't care, honestly. They're much more excited about our pitch rate and our QC and our technical service. If we send out infected yeast, if we, you do QC for a reason. We have to dump batches down the drain sometimes, and that's, lots of money going down the drain, which nobody's really excited about. But that's why you do QC, is to make sure that you're sending out pure culture.
So, Owen, I wanted to give you a minute here at the end to talk about Imperial Yeast, obviously, the products that you offer to homebrewers, and also I think you got a new announcement as well, right?
Yeah, we do. We will be switching over to new packaging, hopefully early next year. Any changes we do are pretty thoroughly investigated, and we're a couple months into that process. About Imperial Yeast, we like to partner up with our partners or customers, whether they're commercial brewers or home brewers, and provide them the best available yeast and the proper pitch rate organically. That's what we do. We're really proud at lead times that we've been able to keep this year, the growth that we've done. We've doubled this year, which is awesome for us. And we want to do it again next year.
That's fantastic. Double growth in 1 year.
Yep. Yeah, we're doubling this year. I think we'll double next year. We have some pretty fun projects coming up on a technical scale that Jess is leading up. And then, we started the year with 63 barrels of fermentation capacity. I think we're up to 150 barrels of fermentation capacity. We just built our newest tank again this week. We're building redundancy in the system. It's just, it's an exciting place to work right now.
That's awesome. Jess, I want to get your closing thoughts. You got any additional thoughts on helping folks make great beer? I know you had technical services, so you must get to interact with a lot of home brewers.
Yeah, definitely. I think it comes back to the original question, why is healthy yeast important? A lot of the technical questions I get are they revolve around using yeast incorrectly or not using enough yeast. It's usually problems with pitch rates or problems with how the yeast is being pitched or wort oxygenation. So the big message I'd throw out to to brewers, professional or home brewers, is just take some time to make sure your yeast is healthy and is going to work well.
Yeah, I do a presentation on off flavors, and going through it a couple times. I think like a dozen of the 16 off flavors are basically caused by yeast, which is interesting.
Yeah, definitely. It's a huge part of making beer. So I guess the saying goes, brewers make wort and yeast makes the beer. So you have to take care of that yeast so it does its job.
And Owen, wanted to get your closing thoughts on helping folks make better beer.
That's just what we try to do every day. My old job was traveling around the country helping people ferment and teaching both home and commercial brewers how to handle their yeast and repitch. And I ran into the same issues over and over and over again, and kind of thought to myself, okay, let's go out and solve them. That's why we started it. That's why we spend the money to provide double or triple as much yeast as anybody else in the industry. And we put as much time and effort into every step of the process. I want people to stop by. I want to walk them through the lab. I want people to know what we do here. We're proud of what we do every day. And it's just, I love the industry. It's super fun to work. I get to hang out and drink a lot of free beer.
Awesome. I think we're coming out there for HomebrewCon this year, aren't we?
Yeah.
HomebrewCon in Portland, right?
Yeah, we're super excited about it. I think we're going to be able to we're deciding between a skee ball or a claw machine at the booth, and trying to look on Craigslist so we can have a skee ball machine at the lab all the time.
I'll have to swing by the lab too while I'm there. It'd be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I think we're actually setting up buses from there straight to the lab and be given tours. And we're excited to have everybody out. Should be fun.
Well, that's in June, HomebrewCon. You can probably look it up as HomebrewCon. I think it's homebrewcon.org for folks. It's a national homebrew conference, of course. Well, thanks again, guys, for coming on the show. Really appreciate it. Owen, it's great to have you on the show.
Yeah, thank you, Brad. Appreciate it.
And Jesse, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
So again, today on the show, I had Owen Lingley, who is co-owner at Imperial Yeast, worked in a variety of companies, and also runs craft canning and bottling, a mobile craft canning and bottling service. And also Jess, who is head of the technical department at Imperial Yeast and has been in the beer industry for over 22 years. Thanks again, Owen.
Thank you.
And Jess?
Thanks. We'll see ya.
A big thank you to Owen Lingley and Jess Caudill for joining me this week. Thanks also to Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Their educational program lets you learn about every aspect of brewing in detail. Take advantage of their fantastic sale and get 20% off any of their courses when you use the offer code BeerSmith2017 at learn.beerandbrewing.com. Again, that's learn.beerandbrewing.com. And also Blickman Engineering, creators of the innovative new BrewVision wireless thermometer. Remotely monitor your brewing system from your iPhone or iPad, record data, set alerts, and grab recipes directly from the BeerSmith cloud. The BrewVision thermometer, another great innovation from BlickmanEngineering.com. And finally, BeerSmith software, the industry standard for home and professional brewers that lets you design great beer recipes and brew with confidence. Download your free 21-day trial from BeerSmith.com today. Thank you for listening. I hope you have a great brewing week.